Hey everyone, welcome back to the Learning Curve podcast. I'm your host, Jericia, and today we are diving into a topic that hits close to home for many of us. Figuring out whether what we're dealing with is a crisis or just a consequence of some past decisions. Have you ever been around a person, or maybe you are that person, whose life seems to be in perpetual crisis? Everything feels urgent. Everything's an emergency. Everything is a dire situation. It seems like you jump from one crisis to the next. But are you really in crisis? Or are you just experiencing the natural consequences of some bad decisions? Let's break it down. First, let's get clear on what I mean when I talk about an emotional crisis and a natural consequence. One of the theories that I really like to practice in my private therapy practice is dialectical behavioral therapy, which was created by Dr. Marsha Linehan. And the way that theory defines crisis is that it's a situation that causes a person significant distress and requires immediate attention. So it could be things that cause you intense emotional pain. There's a sense of urgency behind it. And there's a perception that it's unbearable or overwhelming. Thus, you need a resolution right away. And usually these things are temporary. And if you use effective coping skills, you can usually get through most of these things that we consider an emotional crisis. On the other hand, you have a natural consequence. And that is a result of actions or decisions that you've made over time. So think of it like this. If you've been ignoring your budget for months and then suddenly you find out you're broke, that's a consequence. That's not a crisis. These outcomes are usually predictable. So if you spend up all your money, you won't have any. You can predict that. You can set your watch to that. And they're normally tied directly to our behavior. So how do we figure out if we're facing a crisis or a consequence? And I guess I should have led with this. The reason that I am doing an episode called Is the C for Crisis or Consequence is I was having a conversation yesterday with a dear sister friend, and I was venting a little bit about some folks on my caseload and that everything seems like it's so urgent. But then once I interact with them, I realized it wasn't a crisis. And so she brought up the term crisis versus consequence, and it was like, ding, ooh, podcast episode. So thank you, sis, for the inspiration for this podcast episode. But back to, how do you figure out if we're facing a crisis or if it's just a consequence of some of our poor decisions? Few questions to consider. First off, did this come out of nowhere or has it been brewing for a while? Can you trace it back to a specific decision that you made or a habit that you've been engaged in? And do you feel like your feelings about the situation, are they in proportion or are they blown out of proportion to what is actually happening? So if we think about this in terms of relationships, a crisis could be an unexpected breakup or a sudden betrayal by a friend. These situations can completely blindside us and feel really overwhelming. But on the other hand, if you're facing issues like constant arguments or conflict, gradually distancing or drifting apart, these could really be consequences of some ongoing issues in the relationship, whether it's neglect, poor communication, or just having some unresolved conflicts over time. So I found this really interesting article called The Stress of Living Life in Crisis Mode. According to the article, crisis mode means that your body and your mind are always on high alert. You're hypervigilant and you're constantly bracing for impact or basically waiting for that other shoe to drop. Being stuck in crisis mode is rough on your mental health, but also on your physical health. The body's stress response is not meant to be going 24/7. You can feel like you are always anxious, constantly worrying and feeling overwhelmed. You can feel burned out. The pressure of trying to kind of navigate these crises can just make you feel really emotionally exhausted. There can be ongoing stress that could lead to depression, making you feel really hopeless and disconnected. And you could have a weakened immune system. Stress can make you more susceptible to illnesses. Long-term stress can increase your risk for hypertension and heart issues. It can be digestive issues. It can cause IBS or ulcers. So how do we get out of living in crisis mode? Because it sounds like there's not a whole lot of positive that happens in crisis mode, but it does sound like it takes a whole lot of toll on our mind and our body. So here's a few things. First off, sometimes if you are in a emotional crisis and there is not an immediate solution, so you can't resolve it right away, what might work is just to distract yourself. Focus on something that's bothering you that you don't have an immediate solution for can cause more stress and worry. So trying to distract yourself, focusing on something else, focusing on something that brings you pleasure and joy, focusing on something mindless that just kind of takes your mind off the worry can be really helpful in terms of trying to deal with crisis situations. Learning how to soothe yourself is really important. We have 5 senses that help us to engage with the larger world: sound, smell, taste, touch, sight. All these senses are things that can help us ignite those helpful chemicals in our brain, those endorphins, those feel good, pleasurable chemicals that can kind of help lift our mood and reduce some of our stress. So whether it's listening to some calming music, looking at something that you consider beautiful, smelling something pleasant, tasting something good, taking a warm bath, putting on some lotion, those are all things that can kind of help soothe what we're experiencing by using our 5 senses. We can try to improve the moment. I mean, yeah, things suck right now, but if we stop and think about other times when we've gone through tough situations and that we were able to navigate through, or we can kind of compare ourselves to other individuals who are having even worse times, and that can kind of help mitigate some of the stress or the hopeless feeling that we're having. We can go try to do something for somebody else, take the focus off ourselves. And sometimes by helping to contribute to someone else, that can make you feel better. One thing that's always important when you're faced with the crisis is weighing the pros and cons, figuring out what makes sense in this situation. What should I do to maybe not 100% improve it, but definitely not make it worse? Weigh your options. And then finally, one of my favorite ideas is that of radical acceptance, fully accepting the reality of a situation. And you know that statement that everybody says, it is what it is? Well, it's really true here. Sometimes there are just situations in life that are, and there's nothing that I can do to change it, to influence it, but I can accept it. And understand that this type of acceptance isn't agreement or liking it. It's just merely understanding that this is what the reality is right now. So now I'm not battling with denial. I'm not trying to fight against it. I can really hunker down and try to figure out either a solution or a way to get through it. So living in this state of emotional crisis can be an impact on our mental health. It can be an impact on our physical health. So definitely important to try to greatly label situations as a crisis versus a consequence, but more importantly, to be able to deal with or get through the crisis so that we don't make things worse. So let's talk a little bit about consequences as opposed to these emotional crises. Every choice that we make carries consequences, whether they're good or bad. And so understanding and accepting these is really key for growing as an individual. So a natural consequence are the natural results of your actions. They can be immediate or long-term, expected or unexpected. Now, the difference between a crisis and a consequence is that a crisis is often sudden and you don't really prepare for it. Consequences are usually more predictable and they're going to be directly related to your decisions, such as, for example, if you eat junk food, you might feel sick afterward. Or if you eat poorly when you get up on the scale next week, it's going to be reflected in the numbers that you see. Those would be immediate consequences. A longer term consequence could be over time, if I have bad eating habits, then I put myself at risk for health issues like obesity or diabetes. But not all consequences are negative. There are positive consequences. So because I worked really hard at work and did what I needed to do and I showed up, I get a promotion. But on the other hand, there are negative consequences. So I'm facing financial trouble because I have been exhibiting poor spending habits. Consequences are usually things that we can predict. They're usually directly related to our behavior, our actions. They can be immediate consequences, longer term consequences. They can be positive or they can be negative. So handling the consequences of our decisions, though, can be tough, especially the negative ones. So what can we do? Once again, this idea of radical acceptance is seeping through. We have to accept that it is what it is, and it is because of a decision that I made. Denial just prolongs the stress. Great opportunity for reflection. Think about what got me here, and this will help in the future to make maybe different choices. Take responsibility. Owning up for my actions is going to be really important in moving past this and actually resolving this consequence. Blaming other people for my poor decisions or my poor choices, it doesn't help. Learn from this. One of my favorite tattoos is that of the Sankofa. And this is a West African symbol, but also a proverb that goes with it related to looking in your past, grabbing the lesson and bringing it forward. And so consequences are a great way of teaching us from our experiences. Now we have to be willing to learn. We have to be willing to implement what we've learned. It really helps us to formulate, what do I need to do differently next time to get a different result? Being graceful and forgiving yourself, being kind to yourself, realizing that everybody makes mistakes, including you, and forgiving yourself and moving forward. Staying in that stuck space where you're just ruminating about what I did and why I did it and I shouldn't have done it and I could have done it. If I had another chance, I would. That just keeps you stuck. So moving forward means forgiving, learning my lessons, and committing to doing it differently next time. How do consequences impact our mental health? We talked about in crises how our mental health and our physical health is impacted. We can also be stressed out and anxious due to consequences. We can have regret and guilt. These are natural feelings, but sometimes when we are really lamenting poor choices, we end up dwelling over the regret and the guilt, and that just compounds and makes us feel worse. But a positive thing that can happen is that we're motivated. We will understand that the consequence is because of our actions, and we're motivated to make better choices because, one, we don't want to be in this situation again, and two, we really want to take this as an opportunity to grow. So dealing with consequences is just part of life. And by accepting our responsibility for our choices, reflecting on our choices, learning from our choices, we're going to be able to grow and make better decisions and choices in the future. The process not only helps us personally, but it also prevents small issues that are just consequences to turn into crises. So this is the Learning Curve podcast. So what's the learning curve and what are some of the lessons learned between understanding the difference between crises and consequences? Navigating this learning curve is going to involve understanding that there is a distinction between a crisis and a consequence, and that we need to apply any lessons that we learn to improve our lives. So we need to recognize patterns. So these are these consistent things that we continue to do, or spaces that we continue to find ourselves in that lead us down this road of emotional stress, distress, and pain. And we need to be aware of these patterns and hopefully begin to anticipate or notice triggers that we're headed down those roads so that we can recalculate and change course. Being proactive can really help by addressing small issues before they escalate into crises. And being proactive can prevent our consequences from becoming too overwhelming because we're really being thoughtful when we make choices. Being resilient. We need to get our bounce back game back. Building resilience is learning from your past experience. It's going to strengthen your ability to handle crises and consequences more effectively. Rely on your support system during tough times, whether it's your friends, your families, professional. Having a network can help provide the necessary help and perspective that you might need to navigate what you're going through. Continuously learn. Life is a continuous learning curve. You think you're out of it, and then here comes another one. Embrace each curve as an opportunity to grow and make better decisions. So, understanding the difference between a crisis and a consequence is key for our mental and physical well-being. Being proactive, seeking support, building resilience, we can handle life's challenges more effectively and keep minor issues from becoming overwhelming. Thank you for listening to the Learning Curve podcast. For more resources and support, follow us on Instagram at The Learning Curve PCast. If you'd like to reach out to us with more questions or even like to be a guest on the Learning Curve podcast, please send me an email at thelearningcurvepcast@gmail.com. Remember, navigating life's learning curve is all about gaining insights, adapting, and striving to improve. We're here to help you along the way, so stay tuned for our next episode. And until then, keep learning and growing. Embrace those curves.